Hey, how's it going? So, when the history books are written, in the next few decades or centuries, as the case may be, right? More likely than not, there are going to be historians who are on the side of the Russians and historians who are on the side of the United States and the West, right? But irrespective of their point of view, all of them are going to agree on one central fact, which was that the sanctions that the West imposed against Russia were the most catastrophic miscalculation, perhaps of the century, but certainly of the last 70-odd years. I can think of no other miscalculation except, going back to the Korean War or something like that. I mean, it was just a serious miscalculation because the West was convinced that by applying sanctions, they were just going to break the Russian economy, the Kremlin leadership would collapse, and the war would be over in like 3 weeks because all the Russians would go to the streets protesting about the collapsing economy, Putin would flee to God knows where, and there'd be President Navalny. It's just okay. And now the issue becomes, of course, why was this miscalculation made? It's important to understand why you make a mistake. Just to make a mistake, that's fine. I mean, well, it's not a happy thing, but you have to figure out why you made that mistake. That's the most important thing, because only then can you learn. And what happened, of course, is that in the West, they went by GDP. They assumed that Russia's economy was, in terms of nominal GDP, the size of Italy's or whatever it was, whatever the meme was. It was a small, minor economy. We can just brush it aside and we can break it, with our, sanctions, our all-powerful sanctions. And, of course, that didn't happen. Because, of course, nominal GDP doesn't really measure shit. And people have known this for going on decades now, okay? This is not new information. But it gave the leadership in the West a false perception of Russian weakness, that they'd be able to break the Russian economy and, everything would go their way. It would all come up roses. And, of course, it didn't. And, in fact, the sanctions hurt the European economies far more than the Russian economies. Now, Alexander Mercouris did a video yesterday, as a matter of fact, that was very good, giving an overview of the Russian economic situation. I suggest you go check it out. A lot of you guys are subscribed to Alexander, so you just check your feed. The whole video is like an hour long, and it's terrific. It just gives a generalized overview of the Russian economy, but bottom line, the economy of the Russians is going great. Their inflation is very low. It's like at 4% or something like that, less than 5%. Contrast that to the West's inflation, both in the Eurozone and in the dollar. And insofar as the Russians, they didn't lose a customer, because with the sanctions, they just pivoted and started selling to India and all kinds of other people. And because oil is fungible, these people have in turn taken the Russian oil and bumped it further to the Europeans taking a slice. So in the end, the Europeans are paying more for the same goddamn Russian oil, and the Russians are still making money, it didn't do anything. But anyway, that's not quite exactly what I wanted to stress here. What I want to stress in this video that I'm doing here is that at the same time that this miscalculation happened, Janet Yellen gave a speech the other day, all right? Janet Yellen is the current Treasury Secretary. She was formerly the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve Board, the United States Central Bank. And she said that, sanctions against China would be very bad for the American economy. But at the same time, other people in the Biden administration are saying, well, the American people will have to take a little bit of an economic hit if we're going to save Taiwan. And on top of that, in the speech that Janet Yellen made, where she admitted to the fact that any sanctions against China would really hurt the American economy. See, she said some shit about the Chinese that just pissed them off even more. I mean, the Chinese have not spoken to the Biden administration since the whole balloon incident, which is just, the balloon thing was just mass hysteria over a fucking weather balloon, for crying out loud. And they blamed all the Chinese spying balloons and crap like that, and just had a complete meltdown. And the Chinese just decided, we're not going to deal with these little hysterical kitties. We're just going to ignore them. and they have been ignoring them. Anthony Blinken, embarrassingly, has tried to go to China, and he's been rebuked. So now he's settling for going to Vietnam, see if he can get the Vietnamese to join the Grand Western Alliance against China, which is just fucking funny. But the point I want to make, the serious point, is that, see, the people in the Western leadership class, they did this colossal miscalculation that even now, in the Western mainstream media, they're starting to admit it. 14, 15 months after the fact, they're starting to admit that maybe the sanctions weren't such a good idea. Sanctions against Russia, of course. And yet they're not saying anything about the upcoming sanctions that are going to go towards China, because we're on our way. And you see, the thing here is that these people cannot learn from their mistakes. They certainly can't admit their mistakes. They're so arrogant, hubris. They're so arrogant that they cannot face the fact that they made a colossal miscalculation. And they're going to make a colossal miscalculation with China. Because if you think that the damage done to the European economy, and to a lesser extent the American economy, because of the sanctions imposed against Russia, that was bad, sanctions, full-on sanctions against China, will be catastrophic for the American economy. I mean, forget about de-dollarization. Nobody's going to be using dollars because the Chinese will simply say, no dollars. We're not going to sell any of our goods for dollars to anybody. These assholes in Washington, right? The G7, they met up, the foreign ministers of the G7 countries, and they started floating the idea of outright embargoing Russia. That is, not selling Russia any Western good, right? That's just, doubling down on the whole sanctions mess. And how did that work out? Because these people still have the conception that Russia is still stuck in the 90s, poor and broken, and that there is no country on earth except the West, the United States and the European countries, that can provide the goods and services that Russia needs. They don't seem to understand that the rest of the world has caught up, industrially speaking. They don't seem to understand that, and yet they are reacting to China because they understand that China has caught up and surpassed the United States. See? It's this weird disconnect. They see China as an industrial opponent that has surpassed the United States. It's going to surpass the United States in nominal GDP terms in just a few years, in terms of purchasing power parity, in terms of industrial output. It's far superseded the United States, quite some time ago. And so, because of this, they see China as an existential threat. How exactly is it an existential threat? I don't quite know. Because the Chinese, they don't try to convince other countries to act as they do, as the Americans do. Rather, the Chinese, when they go and interact with other countries, they just want to trade with them. They just want to make money, and they want to leave the country alone. Don't fuck with my shit, and I won't fuck with yours kind of attitude, which is the healthy attitude between nation states. But the United States keeps exporting its quote-unquote values, LGBTQP plus, never forget the P, and all the other insanity of the West. You don't need me to give you a laundry list of that shit, right? But the point is that, see, the Americans want to export this shit that most countries don't want. The Americans want to dominate other countries, and other countries don't like it when you try to dominate them, right? But the Chinese don't do that. They just want to trade. They want to build you infrastructure, not because of the kindness of their hearts, but because it'll make trade more efficient for them. That's all, that's their entire program. And the Russians have problems of their own. They don't want to go fucking around in other countries. They already had that experience with the Soviet Union. And the current leadership in the Kremlin has no imperial ambitions. It certainly wants to look after ethnic Russians, because there is a huge Russian diaspora, ethnic Russian diaspora, that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were huge Russian populations that all of a sudden found themselves in foreign countries, effectively, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, the Baltic republics, right? All of these ethnic republics, all of these ethnic Russians The Russian Federation cares about them and will, as they are doing now in the Donbass, they will protect them. But they're not interested in conquering other people's lands because they've got problems of their own that they want to concentrate on. The Chinese, the same thing. It's the Americans, the American leadership, that has enormous internal problems, huge ones. You know, the vanishing border, the crime, the drug overdose, overdoses rather, the ethnic, racial tension between blacks and just about everybody else. You know, the United States has huge problems, but rather than focusing on those problems, the Americans want to stir trouble in the rest of the world. And so they're getting ready to do this insofar as China is concerned. And this, like I said, there's this weird disconnect. They see that the rest of the world has reached the level of the United States and of Western Europe, and in many instances surpassed them. I mean, all accounts coming out of China, people who've been there, who've spent a lot of time there, they say that China is better than the United States in just about all regards. It's certainly a better place to live. And ultimately, that's what a government should be focusing on. Making sure that the people have an amiable lifestyle, a good life. That's the whole point. If you're not providing that for your people, you're failing as a leadership class. And the American leadership class is failing in that regard. And they're starting trouble with China. And it's all based on miscalculations of not understanding their position in the world. Anyway, this video is a little bit ranty, a little bit all over the place, but I think you see the point. The Americans aren't looking at the rest of the world as it actually is. In some regards, they are, and that freaks them out. In other ways, they are not, and that makes them miscalculate grotesquely. And these miscalculations are going to continue. They're going to continue to miscalculate dramatically in ways that can wind up being catastrophic. And here is the true tragedy. There is no leadership class that is waiting in the wings to shove aside these insane fools and take over and right the Western ship. That's the serious problem of the West. Because the West, the institutions of the West, the way the West selects its leadership class and how they rise up to the top, they all have a vested interest in the system, and they are not going to tip it over. And this system, unfortunately, elevates the most incompetent people. I've said this before a number of times over this past year and a half or so, that the West, the qualities that you need to succeed and rise into positions of leadership are not the same qualities you need to actually be competent in those leadership positions. And this disconnect between actual competence and how you achieve power has led to this incompetent leadership class. And if they were all replaced and the next tier of leaders were brought forth, they would be equally incompetent. And that's the fucking tragedy. Even if there is a complete collapse in the West, and let's just say that they don't go with nuclear weapons, which is what my bet is, that once they go into the Sino-American War and they start losing, the Americans will start using nuclear weapons against the Chinese. But let's assume for the sake of argument that that does not happen. Let's assume for the sake of argument that there is no Sino-American War because the American economy and American society is so fragile and broken up that it just starts to crater, and there isn't the political will to go futzing around with China, and they have to just start, figuring out how to fix the shit show of the collapsing American regime. There isn't going to be anybody to come and save the ship. It's going to sink. And it's because of the leadership class. A leadership class that is unresponsive rather, to the people's will, a leadership class that is parochial, incompetent, and unable to learn from their mistakes. A leadership class that right now is panicking And in this panic, if you are in the United States, for sure you're seeing this, they are becoming more and more repressive. The First Amendment, they are prosecuting people who just said the wrong thing insofar as Russia is concerned, the non-approved message, and they're going to go to jail. You know? I mean, the basic qualities of the West are being betrayed by this incompetent leadership class as they panic. And it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. This is video. I don't know if I'm even going to post it. It's all over the fucking place. But anyway, understand what's going on in my head.